France, June 13th, 1944. 7 days after D-Day. A Sherman tank rolled through morning fog so thick the crew couldn't see 20 feet ahead. Sergeant Lafayette Poole's loader reached for ammunition, his hand hovering between two shells. High explosive, smoke. Every manual said explosive first, every veteran agreed. But something made him grab the smoke round instead, sliding it home with a metallic clang that echoed inside the steel hull. 30 seconds later, they would face 7 Tiger tanks at point-blank range. That stupid decision would be the only reason any of them survived. The 3rd Armored Division had been inland for a week. Sleep came in 20-minute intervals. Coffee tasted like rust and gasoline. The hedgerows of Normandy stretched in every direction, ancient earthen walls thick with roots and brambles, creating a maze where German troops waited in silence. Lafayette Poole was 21 years old. He came from Odem, Texas, where the land stretched flat and the sky went on forever. Here, the world closed in. Every field was a potential kill zone. Every tree line hid death. His crew had been together since training at Fort Knox. 5 men who knew each other's breathing patterns, who could load, aim, and fire in the dark, who spoke in half sentences and understood completely. Corporal Bert Close was the gunner. His hands moved across the controls like a pianist, smooth and certain. He had fired more rounds in 7 days than in 6 months of training. Private First Class Willis Oler loaded the ammunition. 75mm shells, each weighing 14 pounds. High explosive for bunkers. Armor-piercing for tanks. White phosphorus for smoke screens. He could identify them by touch alone in total darkness. The driver, Private Roy Blackwood, had grown up on a farm in Georgia. He understood machinery the way some men understood languages. He could feel when the Sherman was about to throw a track, could hear trouble in the engine before the gauges showed it. The bow gunner, Private Bill Thompson, was 19. He had lied about his age to enlist. Now he sat in the front hull, manning a .30 caliber machine gun, watching the world through a narrow viewport, his field of vision reduced to a slit of green and gray. Their Sherman was designated In the Mood. The name was painted in white letters below the turret. It had taken 3 hits already. Patches of fresh paint covered the scars. 1 round had ricocheted off the front slope. Another had torn through the sponson, missing the ammunition rack by inches. The 3rd had killed the radio operator 2 days before Thompson took his place. They didn't talk about that. The morning of June 13th came cold and wet. Fog rolled across the Norman countryside, thick as wool, muffling sound and sight. The division was pushing toward Villers-Bocage, a small market town that intelligence said was lightly defended. Intelligence was often wrong. Poole stood in the commander's cupola, his body above the turret, scanning the fog. He could feel the tension in his chest, the way his breath came shallow. 7 days of this. 7 days of watching friends burn. 7 days of wondering when it would be his turn. "How's our ammo?" he called down to Oler. 14 AP, 22 HE, 6 smoke. Oler replied, his voice steady despite the fear they all carried. Armor-piercing rounds for tanks. High explosive for everything else. Smoke for screening withdrawals or marking targets for artillery. The doctrine was clear. First round loaded should always be high explosive. You never knew what you'd encounter. Buildings, machine gun nests, infantry. He was versatile. It was safe. But something nagged at Poole. Call it intuition. Call it superstition. The fog was wrong. The silence was wrong. Everything about this morning felt like a trap waiting to spring. "Load smoke," he said. Uller's hands paused. "Smoke? You sure, Sarge?" "Yeah. Load smoke." Below, Oler pulled a white phosphorus round from the rack. It was a strange choice, stupid even. But he had learned to trust Poole's instincts. The sergeant had kept them alive this long. The shell slid home. The breech closed. Inside the turret, the crew waited. They rolled forward into the fog. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for the Sherman. Hedgerows rose on both sides, 12 feet high. Ancient earthen walls covered in thorns and ivy. Trees arched overhead, their branches meeting in the middle, creating a tunnel of green shadow even in full daylight. In the fog, it was like moving through milk. Poole's eyes strained. He could see maybe 30 feet. The Sherman's engine rumbled loud in the silence. Their tracks clattered over the cobblestones. Every sound felt amplified, announcing their presence to anyone listening. "Slow," Poole ordered. 5 miles per hour. Blackwood eased off the accelerator. The Sherman crept forward. They had been moving for 10 minutes when the fog began to thin. Not clearing exactly, but thinning enough that shapes emerged. Trees, fence posts, the outline of a building. And then, through the mist, something massive. Poole saw it first. A dark shape, angular and enormous, positioned at the intersection ahead. His mind processed the silhouette. Tiger tank. His heart stopped, then started again, hammering against his ribs. "Contact front," he said, his voice calm despite the ice in his veins. "Tiger, 2 o'clock, 100 yards. In the turret, Close was already traversing. The electric motor whined. The barrel swung right. But the fog played tricks. As they moved forward another 20 feet, more shapes emerged. Not one Tiger, not two, 7. 7 Tiger tanks, positioned in a semicircle around the intersection. A perfect ambush. Each Tiger mounted an 88mm gun that could punch through a Sherman's armor from over a mile away. Each weighed 56 tons. Each had frontal armor so thick that American 75mm guns could barely scratch it. The Sherman weighed 33 tons. Its armor was paper. Its gun was adequate for infantry support, marginal against German medium tanks, and nearly worthless against Tigers. They had driven into a kill zone at point-blank range. For one stretched second, nobody moved. The German crews hadn't seen them yet. The fog still provided partial concealment. But the moment the Americans fired, 7 Tigers would light them up. 7 rounds would converge on their position. The Sherman would brew up like a bonfire, gasoline and ammunition cooking off, turning the crew into ash and memory. Poole's training screamed at him. Reverse, back out, radio for support, get artillery on this position. But backing up meant exposing their thin rear armor. It meant making noise. It meant the Tigers would spot them immediately and fire while they were helpless. The Sherman moving slowly backward, unable to maneuver or return effective fire. They couldn't fight. They couldn't run. The only option was the impossible one. "Smoke," Poole breathed. "Fire smoke." Close pressed the trigger. The gun roared. The Sherman rocked back on its suspension. Inside the turret, the sound was like being inside a church bell. The breech flew open. Empty shell casing ejected, clanging against the floor. Smoke filled the compartment, acrid and choking. The white phosphorus round exploded directly in front of the lead Tiger, maybe 70 yards away. White smoke erupted. Not a thin screen, but a wall. White phosphorus burned at 5,000 degrees, throwing smoke in all directions, thick and impenetrable. The fog had been bad. This was total blindness. The German crews heard the shot. They traversed their turrets, searching for targets. But they couldn't see anything. "Load AP, right 30, fire when ready," Poole shouted. Osler slammed an armor-piercing round home. Close adjusted aim. The smoke was spreading, covering their position, but they could still see the dark outline of the Tiger through gaps in the white fog. "On the way!" Close squeezed the trigger. The second shot punched through the smoke. Metal rang on metal. The armor-piercing round hit the Tiger's turret at an angle, ricocheting upward in a shower of sparks. No penetration, but it didn't matter. "Driver, reverse. Full speed." Blackwood threw the transmission into reverse. The Sherman lurched backward, tracks screaming. They crashed through the hedgerow behind them, branches snapping, the tank tilting as it climbed the earthen wall. The Tigers were firing now, blind shots into the smoke. 88mm rounds tore through the air where the Sherman had been seconds before. One struck a tree, exploding it into splinters. Another hit the road, sending cobblestones flying like shrapnel. Poole's Sherman backed into a field, still moving, still covered by the smoke screen. The fog wrapped around them again. The Tigers kept firing, but they were shooting at ghosts. "Left, left, get us into those trees," Poole directed. Blackwood spun the Sherman. They crashed through a fence, scattering sheep, and dove into a small copse of birch trees. The branches scraped against the turret. They stopped, engine idling, hidden in the shadows. Behind them, the intersection erupted. The Tigers had realized they'd been tricked. They were moving now, engines roaring, trying to find the American tank that had appeared and vanished like smoke itself. Inside, in the mood, the crew sat in stunned silence. Thompson broke it first. "We're alive." "We're alive," Aller repeated, his voice shaking. Poole's hands trembled on the cupola. He had just violated every rule in the book. He had engaged 7 Tigers at point-blank range with a Sherman. It should have been suicide, but the smoke round had saved them. That stupid wrong against doctrine smoke round. "Sarge," Close said quietly. "How did you know?" Poole didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about Texas, about hunting with his father, about how his dad always said to trust your gut when something felt wrong. "I didn't know," he said finally. "Just felt right." Later, military analysts would study this engagement. They would note that Poole's decision had violated standard operating procedure. They would point out that loading smoke first was tactically unsound, that he had gotten lucky, that his crew survived by chance rather than skill. But the men in that Sherman knew different. Poole had read the situation. He had felt the ambush before seeing it. He had loaded the one round that could give them a chance, and when the moment came, he hadn't hesitated. They sat in the birch grove for 20 minutes, long enough for the Tigers to give up searching, long enough for their hands to stop shaking. Poole radioed battalion. His report was brief, factual. 7 Tigers at map coordinates such and such. Request artillery support. The response came back immediately. Air support was inbound. Artillery was ranging. The entire battalion was rerouting. The intersection at Villers-Bocage would be hit with everything the Americans had. But for now, Poole and his crew waited. "Check ammunition," Poole ordered. The routine helped, gave them something to focus on besides the fact that they should be dead. 13 AP, 21 HE, 5 smoke, Aller reported. 1 smoke round had saved 5 lives. Thompson was looking at his hands. They were steady now, but he remembered how they'd trembled when the Tigers opened fire. "I've never been that close to dying," he said quietly. "None of us have," Close replied. But that wasn't quite true. They had all been close to dying. Every day since landing at Utah Beach, death had been a constant companion. They had seen Shermans brew up, watched friends burn, heard men screaming over the radio as their tanks were penetrated. This was different, though. This time they had looked death directly in the face. 7 Tigers, point-blank range, no escape, no cover, no hope. And they had survived. "The smoke was genius," Blackwood said from the driver's seat. "How'd you know, Sarge?" Poole thought about that question. How had he known? He hadn't, not really, but he had felt something. The fog, the silence, the way the hedgerows formed perfect kill zones. His subconscious had been screaming danger, screaming ambush, screaming that they needed concealment more than they needed firepower. "Just a feeling," he said. In the years after the war, military historians would debate Poole's decision. Some would call it brilliant tactical thinking. Others would call it dumb luck. A few would note that Poole had an almost supernatural ability to sense danger, to read battlefields in ways that couldn't be taught. By war's end, Lafayette Poole would be credited with destroying 258 enemy vehicles. He would become one of the most successful tank commanders in American history. He would survive Normandy, the breakout across France, the fighting in Belgium. But he would always remember June 13th, 1944, the day he loaded smoke instead of high explosive, the day he violated doctrine and saved his crew. Years later, in a letter to Bert Close, Poole would write about that morning. "I don't know why I called for smoke," he wrote. "Something just told me we needed to disappear more than we needed to fight. Maybe it was God. Maybe it was luck. Maybe I was just scared enough to think different. But I'm glad you trusted me." Close wrote back, "I'd follow you anywhere, Sarge, even into fog with 7 Tigers waiting." The artillery strike hit the intersection 30 minutes later. 155mm shells rained down, turning the crossroads into a crater. The Tigers withdrew, moving back toward Villers-Bocage. American armor advanced cautiously, finding the position abandoned except for track marks and empty shell casings. Poole's Sherman rejoined the battalion that afternoon. Other tank commanders wanted to know what happened. "How do you engage 7 Tigers and live?" "Don't engage them," Poole said. "Disappear." It wasn't a satisfying answer. American tank doctrine emphasized firepower and aggression. You saw the enemy, you shot the enemy. You closed to effective range and you fought. But Poole had done something different. He had prioritized survival over engagement. He had used his weapon not to destroy but to conceal. He had turned the Sherman's weakest characteristic, its thin armor and inferior gun, into an advantage by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. The smoke round had bought them time to reverse, time to hide, time to call for support, and time was the one thing that kept you alive in a Sherman. Other crews started changing their loading procedures. Not officially. The manuals still said high explosive first. But in practice, more and more commanders started keeping smoke readily available. Some even loaded it first when advancing into uncertain terrain. The brass noticed. After-action reports mentioned Poole's engagement. Training protocols were revised, not dramatically but enough. Smoke rounds were given greater emphasis. Tactical withdrawal was presented as a viable option, not cowardice. One engagement, one decision, one smoke round, and it changed how tank crews thought about survival. But there was a darker truth beneath the survival story. The Sherman was outclassed, badly. Every American tank crew knew it. They joked about it, dark humor to cover fear. A Ronson, they called it. Lights first time, every time. Like the cigarette lighter. The Germans called them Tommy Cookers, gasoline-powered death traps that burned their crews alive. Tank crews had the highest casualty rate of any branch except bomber crews. 80% of Shermans that were hit caught fire. Of those fires, 70% killed the crew. The math was simple and brutal. Poole's crew had gotten lucky, but luck runs out. On September 19, 1944, near the German border, Poole's Sherman hit a mine. The explosion tore through the bottom armor, igniting ammunition. Poole was blown out of the turret, his leg shattered. Close and Oehler were killed instantly. Blackwood died in the fire. Thompson managed to escape, badly burned. Lafayette Poole survived the war. He recovered from his wounds. He went home to Texas, married, raised children, lived a long life. He never talked much about the war, but he kept a photograph. 5 young men standing in front of a Sherman tank, in the mood painted on the hull, summer 1944, before Villers-Bocage, before the Tigers, before everything changed. They're smiling in the photograph. They don't know yet what's coming. They don't know that 3 of them will be dead before autumn. They don't know that the 4th will carry burn scars for the rest of his life. They don't know that the 5th will wake up screaming for decades. But in that moment, they're alive. They're together, their crew. And on June 13, 1944, when Lafayette Poole made a decision that every manual said was wrong, those 5 men got to live one more day. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. One more day. The smoke round trick worked once, just once. Poole never faced 7 Tigers at point-blank range again, but he didn't need to. That one moment, that one decision, taught him something that would keep him alive through months of combat. Trust your instincts. Know when to fight and when to vanish. Understand that survival is victory. The military eventually caught up with what Poole had already figured out. Later, Sherman variants carried more smoke rounds. Doctrine evolved to emphasize concealment. Tank destroyers took on the role of killing Tigers while Shermans focused on supporting infantry. But in June 1944, none of that existed yet. It was just one crew, one sergeant, and one decision that should have been wrong but turned out to be exactly right. Military historians still study the engagement. They analyze Poole's split-second choice. They debate whether it was tactical genius or blind luck. They construct elaborate theories about battlefield awareness and intuitive decision-making. The men who were there had a simpler explanation. Poole had a feeling, Bert Close said in an interview decades later, and we trusted him. Trust. In war, it's everything. Trust in your crew. Trust in your equipment. Trust in the man giving orders when metal is flying and the world is ending. Lafayette Poole earned that trust by bringing his men home alive, one impossible day at a time. The smoke round at Villers-Bocage wasn't the first time Poole saved his crew. It wouldn't be the last, but it was the most dramatic, the most impossible. The moment when everything hung in perfect balance between death and survival. And it all came down to one stupid decision to load the wrong shell first. Sometimes stupid is brilliant. Sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to survive. And sometimes, in the fog and fear of war, the wrong choice turns out to be the only right one.